Red Cave Podcast. Reading tonight from Tales from the Cracks, numbers 33 through 35. Starting with The Morning People, followed by Moon's Majesty, and concluded with Too Much Sleep. I awoke in the midsummer not to call night, in the white and the walk of the morning. The moon dwindled and thinned to the fringe of a fingernail held to the candle, or paring of paradiscal fruit, lovely and waning but lustless, stepped from the stool, drew back from the barrow of dark Manifah, the mountain. A cusp still clasped him, a fluke yet fanged him, entangled him, not quit utterly. This was the prized, the desirable sight, unsought, presented so easily, parted me with leaf and leaf, divided me eyelid and eyelid of slumber. Lovely. Gerard Manley Hopkins. The Morning People. Peter wasn't surprised to see him on the train, but the sling and bandages supporting his left arm had come across as a shock. Several different band-aids and strips of surgical tape snaked along the curves of his knuckles to end at his bruised fingers. Their eyes met, and Peter quickly looked out the window, even though it was much too dark to see anything. All he could make out was his own oversized reflection, squinting back at him. There weren't many others on the 1 a.m. train headed south. In fact, Peter was usually the only one. Yet on a rare few occasions another passenger, a man of about his same age, would join him for the ride. They would both get off at the boardwalk, which was the very last stop, and go their separate ways. Now that Peter had just lost his job, this was sure to be their last encounter. He had really come to identify with the man. It didn't matter why he was on the train or where he was going. It was the sheer fact that they were there together at the same time while the rest of the town was asleep. Peter eyed the man again, but was once more caught in the act. This time they made eye contact, and the man's beard twitched before breaking open into a wide grin. While the train was still moving, the man managed to shuffle across the aisle to sit next to Peter. He held out his good hand as they shook. "How are you this morning?" the man asked. "No complaints. I just got off work." "Great. I just got back from the emergency room," he said, patting his sling. "I'm Mark, by the way." Peter meant to introduce himself, but Mark continued. "You're getting off at the boardwalk, right?" he asked. "Why?" "I'll give you $200 if you help me fill a hole," Mark said, pulling 2 paper bills out of his jeans. "As you can see, I can't operate a shovel with this arm. I just injured it tonight." He placed the money into Peter's open hand. Peter closed his hand around the cash, knowing that it was going to be his only income for the upcoming weeks, or months. "What hole? At the beach?" "I think it's best if I show you." Peter's eyebrows crossed, and Mark seemed to read his mind. "It's not what you think. It's just a hole. I found something on the beach which I'd like to keep hidden. That is to say, buried. But it's nothing criminal. I'm just trying to keep something safe, that's all." "Keep what safe?" Peter pressed. Mark got up without an answer and migrated toward the exit. He waited there on the steps, balancing himself on a steel handrail. Peter joined him at the doors and steadied him by lightly touching his back. "How'd you hurt your arm?" "I was bit," he replied, and that was all he had to say on the subject. Peter followed Mark onto the boardwalk and then onto the beach. He couldn't see the ocean from where he was, but he could hear it break and sigh somewhere over his shoulder. He thought he could even feel the surf's tickle on the nape of his neck, carried on the tails of a soft breeze. When Mark motioned for him to venture underneath the boardwalk and into the shadows, Peter hesitated. "You don't have a body pack there, do you?" Mark laughed and shook a flashlight out of his sling. He pointed the beam of light over into the darkness at what appeared to be a grave in the sand. A closer glance revealed that the hole was actually pretty shallow. Peter refused to move any closer, so Mark approached the hole, stooped over, and heaved open a trapdoor. "They're catacombs," Mark said, flashing his light down into the well. "I came across it one day with a metal detector. Imagine this if you can. It's an underground system of tunnels that can open anywhere in the city. You'd be surprised at how many trapdoors there are just like this one. They always seem to open up into some basement or cellar. Every time I come out here I have to dig up the trapdoor and then bury it when I leave. I haven't told anybody about it, but you're an exception. I'm going to have to trust you." Now Peter was standing next to Mark. peering into the dark hole. He could see a small ladder ending at a floor of wet concrete. "No one knows about these tunnels? How can that be?" he asked. "Well, someone knows about them. They only lead to select places in the town, the police station being one of them." "What are they used for?" Mark shrugged. "I'd have to guess drugs, but what do I know?" "Why do you keep burying it?" Mark thought about this. "Probably because I want it to be my secret. I have a selfish need to protect what's mine, and I do feel privileged to know it's here. Can we go down there?" Mark pointed at a shovel leaning up against a beam. "We should really start burying it. It's too dangerous right now." "Dangerous?" Mark's injured arm twitched inside the sling, and he cradled it to his chest. "These tunnels are meant to be a secret. I know now to use extreme caution, because I'm not the only one who goes down there, and the other men that do are even more cautious." Peter nodded that he understood. Mark closed the trapdoor and handed Peter the shovel, who took his time in accepting it. He held the shovel in his hands awkwardly, like it was an alien piece of technology he was not schooled in. And then, with one fleeting glimpse at his strange new comrade, Peter dug the spade into the pile of sand and deposited his first scoop onto the trapdoor. Mark set the flashlight down in the sand, the light illuminating the hole as Peter worked, and while Mark enjoyed a cigarette with his back turned, Peter kicked the flashlight into the hole and made it disappear. By the time Mark returned attention, the hole was already buried, and Peter was handing him his shovel. It didn't take long to finish the job, only 5 short minutes and a dozen or so shovelfuls. He patted the sand flat with Mark's instruction, and they shook hands. Mark slung the shovel over his good shoulder. "Maybe next week we can meet up and do some exploring," Mark said as they ducked out from under the boardwalk. They started the short trek up the beach. "I'd like that," Peter said. "Can we meet here, same time tomorrow night?" Mark gave him a sideways glance, and he was smiling. "I don't like secrets. Even when I was a kid I couldn't mind my own business," Peter said. "I'm the same way, and yes, there's something very exciting about these tunnels. I don't blame you there." Up on the boardwalk, Mark stopped to consider. "Maybe it would be a good idea to partner up, 2 heads. He shook Peter's hand a second time. "See you tomorrow." And then he was walking alone up the street, using his shovel as a walking cane. He disappeared under the harsh sheen of the streetlights. Peter did not follow him. He stood in place for a long time, staring out at the ocean, shuffling and reshuffling his thoughts. Yes, there was something exciting about those tunnels. Something very exciting. When he saw that Mark was truly gone, he hurried back to the dig site, which he found quite easily thanks to the mass of fresh footprints, and he fell on his knees. He immediately started digging into the sand with his hands, and he soon came across the buried flashlight, still alive with light. He turned it off and continued digging. By the time he was done, his hands were raw and the joints in his arms and shoulders were sore. He grasped the steel handle for the trapdoor and pulled it open, thin tendrils of sand trickling down through his legs and into the darkness. With the flashlight in his pocket, he climbed down the ladder. He took his first look around, at least as far as his flashlight beam could probe. He aimed the light directly in front of him, and he could see that the single tunnel was about to branch out into 2 more, one going left and one going right. The straight way continued at a falling incline, deeper and deeper underneath the city. There were limitless possibilities fanning out in front of him, and he had the light to pinpoint every one. He wanted to go tromping down into the darkness like a lucky excavator stumbling across an Egyptian tomb, but there was also something very uneasy about what he was facing. There was Mark to think about, his injury, and his strict words of warning. Those could not be ignored, at least not while he was on his own. Not until tomorrow would he really get to stretch his legs. As Mark had said, 2 heads. He decided that he would walk forward a little ways. That way he couldn't possibly get lost, and he could get a feeling for how far the tunnels truly stretched. He walked past the fork, picking up his pace as he went. In a matter of minutes he came across another juncture in the tunnel and decided he had come far enough. He turned around and walked straight, but after 10 more minutes of hiking, he still hadn't met up with the trapdoor. 10 minutes turned to 20. The catacombs seemed to exhale and a chilled wind blew past. The air didn't sit above him like a cloud. It enveloped him. It pushed and pulled him. Gradually, the ceiling proved to be too low to stand upright, so he had to walk with his back bent, his hair grazing the concrete. Another strong gust of wind filled his lungs and dried his eyes, and then the breath was suddenly on his back, nudging him on. His breathing was growing harsher and his steps were haphazard and heavy. Even the tunnel was cool. He was sweating and his mouth was going dry. His light went out a few minutes later, and his heart thumped against his ribcage. He screamed for help, all the while trying to shake his flashlight into cooperation. He lost all sensation in his legs, his feet, his pounding head and heart. All he could focus on was the smothering darkness, churning with substance in front of him, and his eyes as they widened remarkably huge in the dark, begging with flooding tears for a sliver of light. In those quick moments of panic, his mind started sputtering with very real images. He pictured Mark on the boardwalk, startled with the realization that he had forgotten his flashlight, and returning to see that the trapdoor had been dug up again. Mark would then come down to rescue him, calling his name and leading him by the hand back out into the night. But no one responded to his calls, and no helpful hands materialized out of the darkness to take his. Then he ran into a wall, and his hands found a ladder. He gratefully climbed it and heaved open a trapdoor. The first thing that hit him was the explosive light, and the second was a pungent odor, which he recognized as wet dog fur. In an instant, the dogs were leaping at the inside of a cage, flashing their teeth and barking their protest. There was a man standing in the cage with the dogs, filling up their bowls with a gallon jug of water. He pushed past the animals and furrowed his brow, watching Peter closely. Peter scanned the remaining quarters of the basement and picked out a lone screwdriver lying dormant on the floor, within his reach. "A gopher should never poke his head out of a hole unless he dug it himself," the man said. "The last guy who stumbled in here knows the truth of this." "Just let me leave," Peter compromised. "Let me use your door and I'm gone. I have a better idea. Go back into that hole, and I'll let my dogs come after you." Peter's eyes flashed to the stairs. The man noticed. "I will open this gate, and my dogs will kill you." He looked away for a second to pat one of the two German shepherds on the head, and it made as if to snap at him. In that split second, Peter had snagged the screwdriver and slipped it into his pocket. The man reached for the cage door, and the dogs were already pushing it in, ready for their master to trigger the lock. Peter's hands and feet decided for him. They carried him back down the ladder and a safe distance through the tunnel. He folded into a deep crouch, wielding the stolen screwdriver. He sat there in the darkness and listened, counting every helpless heartbeat. Suddenly, he heard the click of their nails on the concrete. That got him running again, into a dark space without ceilings, walls, or floors. He was at the center of the universe, fleeing from an invisible set of monsters. He wanted nothing more than to chew on his bones amid all that peace and quiet, where even the forgotten breath of the underground would come to taste his insides, just as he had tasted the insides of his city. Further up the tunnel, he saw a hint of light, dwindling and soft, but he wasn't sure if his eyes were playing tricks on him or not. It would glimmer and disappear, bright one second with a pool of light casting across the ceiling, and then only a star the next second, barely visible. He heard the dogs behind him, far away, but they were barking excessively, as though to remind him they were still there. Then the light began to grow brighter, and he knew that it was for real. His feet tangled together, and he was on his stomach. There were legs advancing toward him, and a strong hand fell on his back. Peter reacted with a hellish scream, closely followed by the upward swing of his weapon. There was a crack, and the light went out. The lighter clacked to the concrete, and something much heavier joined it. Peter kicked the lighter in the process of standing upright, and he found it fast. He hurriedly flicked the wheel. The first feature to swim into focus was the handle of Peter's screwdriver, protruding from a thicket of hair, and the second was a sling. The Moon's Majesty. She tightened the blindfold around her eyes and then tilted her head to the side, as if trying to look at something from another angle. She gripped the handle of her sword tight, her jaw working thoughtfully. Walker watched her vain attempt at protecting herself and noted a meager elegance about her work. He saw a perfect balance. Her legs met at an acute angle as they crossed into the lotus position, and the sword in her hand acted as a weight to keep her grounded. Her back was to the water, and if she chose to let go of that weapon, which outsized her by more than a few pounds, she would go tumbling backward down the hill and into the sea. She couldn't see the water crashing at her back, but she could hear it, and Walker was sure the noise filled her head. Her purple robes were torn and frayed at the knees, and the sash had long ago been discarded, making for a loose-fitting garment of soiled silk, barely hanging off her shoulders. She had chopped her hair short just recently, and he looked upon her face for the first time, which held a boyish quality he quite admired. Her jewels were gone, traded months ago for spending money. Her slippers were now replaced with hemp sandals, and her arms and legs were ripe with bruises and scrapes. Her face was no longer rosy. It was tan with sun and hard like leather. She was so beautiful. Walker tried to keep her mind occupied. He wanted her to forget that they only had a slice of bread to their names and 2 dull swords to protect them from harm. He wanted her to forget that she would never see again, if only for a moment. So he told her a story as they sat upon that barren hill, where the grass did not dare to grow, and where a circle of ritualistic stones kept them enclosed inside a pit of spent magic. Walker couldn't say what that hill had once served as. A refuge, a home, or a place of sacrifice? Now it was there to mark the place of his last stand. He told her a story. It was the only one he knew. "Do you know what my first memory is?" he asked her. He leaned against his walking cane and folded into a sitting position. The morning was new all around them, and the cool wind picked up, spraying them with ocean foam. He turned up his soiled collar, but she was unmoved, clutching her sword defiantly, staring into the darkness of her blindfold and into the darkness of her own mind. "It seems so strange, but I was only a lad. I remember looking out at a road, and would you believe that it grew before me, as though it were being paved before my very eyes? I had a knapsack in my arms. I'm not sure where I got it. I wasn't sure what I was doing or who I was. I followed the road and found a cottage. 2 people took me in, and they became my mother and father. My father was a magician, and my mother a priestess. My father taught me the art of alchemy, which later became my base interest in medicine. My mother taught me about the oversoul and the path to enlightenment. I never found enlightenment, I'm afraid. I suppose it is too late for that." "I know this story," she told him quietly. "How? I never told you my past." "Next you left your father's home and met a mentor, who initiated you into your new community. You fell in love with a girl, you won, you lost, and then cut your ties with the world in pursuit of a new beginning, which you saw in me. This is the hero's journey. We all have the same story, and the journey is also the path to enlightenment. This whole time you've been working for one thing." "That's the most you've spoken to me in a long time," he replied. "What part of the journey is this? How far do we have to go?" "The tower is about to fall. I think we better prepare ourselves." He looked out at the horizon in front of him. The camps had not moved for hours. The fires hadn't even been put out yet. They were backed into a corner, one they could not escape. Olin had set up 4 large camps, one in the northwest, one in the northeast, and 2 in the east and west. Walker could see the smoke from their fires and the flags atop their tents, whipping with the breeze. And now they had the ocean at their backs, with nowhere else to go. Soon Olin would send a team of his men up into the hills to scour the area for them. They sat at the top of the tallest hill, where there were no trees to protect them. Certainly they would be found, but they had weapons to defend and the upper ground to their advantage. To Olin, the general of the Kundal army, Walker was a kidnapper, dragging Olin's daughter across the countryside against her will. But in actuality, it was she who came looking for Walker's help. She was to be the catalyst for a great war, where she would be kidnapped by a neutral nation and then rescued. It would all be staged, to use her pretty face to justify a horrendous conflict between kingdoms. When she learned of her destiny, she took a long fall from the castle walls, trying to escape. When she woke up, she was blind. Olin sent her to Walker, the medicine man, to aid in her recovery. Instead of healing her, Olin's daughter asked him to help her escape. They would be on the run, as a couple hermits, living in constant struggle against Olin and his military. Once Walker learned of the horrible war to come, he agreed to help her, and they left the kingdom for good, making do on charities, food, and shelter. They moved from village to camp, camp to town, growing ever more exhausted, yet remained one step ahead of her father. They faced many confrontations with Olin's army. Once in the forest of Teluge, Walker broke a rib and lost 3 fingers. And there was the minor struggle in the Kanda desert, where he was struck by an arrow in the lower back. The battle wounds across his face had long since healed into pink scars, and his frame was gaunt and weary. He had lost much of his fighting spirit over the last year in exile. On the hill of his last defense, there was nothing but his responsibility for that girl to charge his core. But she had become even stronger, though she was not able to see. Though she had lost all her youth and royal standing, she was a warrior. The rest of her senses had been heightened, along with an overpowering sense of higher influence, as if the sun shone directly on her and no one else. "They knew where we are," she said to him. "They're coming up behind us." Walker turned around and looked out at the ocean. Sure enough, coming up the south side of the hill were 2 scouts. They were only ants from where he stood, but he could make out their features. Neither of them was dressed in armor. In fact, they were dressed as peasants. They carried no banners or spears or torches. Walker struggled to raise his sword, brandishing it in front of him in a warrior stance. His muscles cried out in pain, and his limbs shook. The 2 men charged up the hill of dead grass and weeds, shading their eyes from the sun to better see the top. But the distance was much too large for them to see Walker just yet. He still held the advantage. "They are unarmed," he said to her. "I can ambush them before they grow close. We have done it before." "It is my father Olin," she said. "Your father? But he is dressed as a peasant. He carries no protection, and his escort is a mere runt. He calls for a truce, an understanding. He knows that we are done, and so do we." "An understanding? For you to submit to slavery? Is that what you wish?" "No, do not wish to go back." "Then we will both die." She did not answer him, and he took her silence with accord. He reclaimed his post at the top of the hill and looked down on their guests. They were much closer this time, unbelievably so. He could now see their faces, and one of them was certainly Olin. Around his belt he carried 4 chalices, which clattered together like golden bells. His black hair was pulled back into a ponytail, and his characteristic sideburns were unkempt and bushy. He was just as gaunt as Walker, with black bags under each eye. He appeared to be dying, and he carried with him a cloudy black aura. Walker was sure that he could kill this man. Olin saw Walker at the top of the hill and raised his hand to gain his attention. "Dare not come any closer, Olin, or I will send a boulder crashing down on your head," Walker screamed. "I come here only for counsel," he called. "I bring with me 4 cups, so that the 4 of us may drink and come to an agreement. Let us put this ordeal of toil behind us." "We care not to hold counsel with you. Now return to your camps and march at us with all the fury of your men. That is how we must settle this war. We should speak, young captor. I no longer wish to war." They stopped in their tracks momentarily. The escort patted the dust off his clothes. "Let them enter our circle," she said to Walker. "What? Why would we risk our lives by meeting those devils?" he said. "Let them speak with us. We will hear what they have to say." He reluctantly turned back to address the men, but they were already at the top, only yards away, and they entered the circle of stones. Walker drew his sword with surprise, but she motioned for him to lower the weapon. Olin and his escort stood in place, waiting for an invitation. Walker sat down cross-legged next to her and laid the sword across his lap. "Come, father, sit with us," she said. Olin and his escort sat down across from them. "I am happy to see you, daughter," the general said. "It has been many months. I see that you have met your share of trials. You are so thin and carry so many scars." "And I can hear by your voice that you too are worse for wear," she replied. "You are not the only one low on provisions," Olin continued. "My men have very limited supplies. In pursuing you, we have lost more people through starvation than battle. I beg of you now, return with me to the kingdom, to your home, so we can put this horrible journey to rest. Too much has been lost already." "We will not surrender to you," Walker hissed. Olin looked upon him with sadness. He freed the 4 cups from his belt and nodded to his escort. The escort took out a flagon of wine and filled all 4 glasses. He then placed 2 cups in the dirt in front of them. "I was hoping that we could drink in agreement," Olin said. "You will leave us now and cease your pursuits. Besides," Walker knocked over the nearest chalice, wine soaking into the dirt like blood, "this is poisoned." "But she is my daughter." "She does not wish to be," Walker said. "Why do you not let my daughter speak?" "Very well, father, I will speak," she said. "Long ago my life was drawn out for me, and I saw that this world would fall. If I did not leave the kingdom, then the end would never come. I now see that I am the star.
I once thought that I was justice, and maybe I was for a short time, but this sword could not stay sharp forever. Once this world crumbles, I will shine the light over the darkness and guide the dreamer home." "Who is the dreamer?" Olin asked. "This man, here." She pointed a blind hand at Walker. "He was put here, in this place, to protect me from you. He was destined to bring me to the top of the tallest hill, overlooking the water, so I may rise up into the sky and take my rightful place." Olin immediately began to change shape. His neck elongated into that of a serpent, and he collapsed into his clothes. The escort beside him turned into a rotting corpse dressed in black rags, which were almost as frayed as the flesh hanging from his grinning skull. He blinked his eyes at them and drew a dagger from his sleeve. "You love this woman, do you not?" the serpent asked Walker. "I do," he screamed, rising to his feet. "She has tempted you far more than I ever could," it laughed. Walker stopped its laughter by chopping through its head with his sword. It fell still. The sun plummeted out of the sky and collided with the horizon, causing a terrible firestorm, which consumed the 4 camps. Walker watched all the flags burn up like matchsticks. The moon rose up full and huge, bringing with it a black sky, which spread from north to south like a silky inkblot. Olin's daughter now shone with a fierce intensity of light. She rose up into the air, still in the lotus position, and hovered below the moon as a bright corona, the star, Venus, Lucifer, the light-bringer. The dead man came at Walker in a whirl of black robes. The whole earth shook as he pounced, and Walker felt the waters come up to consume the land and extinguish the fire. Walker fell over as the dagger plunged into his heart. The last thing he saw was the moon, great and vivid above his head. He died wondering what it had all been for.
Moon's Majesty, Part 2. "That's right, Mr. Walker. Blink a few times now. Try to move your fingers for us. Very good. Now your toes. Excellent." A light burned over his head. It was as big and bright as the sun. He wanted to open his eyes all the way, but the light was much too intense. "We'll dim the spotlight for you now. How's that? You can sit up if you like." He sat up with the help of the men around him, and they got him to put his feet on the floor. "We won't have you try and walk just yet. Just sit there for a moment and answer our questions as best as you can." The man speaking was short and trim, wearing a white lab coat and latex gloves. There were 3 other men in white standing around him, and another 2 men across the room dressed in gray uniforms. They wore guns on their belts. They frowned at him from their place by the door. He looked around the room and saw that it wasn't much of anything. It was a concrete cell with a large spotlight in the ceiling. There was barely enough room for his bed, let alone the 7 extra men. The door looked heavy, locked into place with a steel bar. "My name is Dr. Renard," the little man said. "Do you know your name? Try to speak." "Terrence, my last name's Walker," he croaked. His hands explored the many different wires stuck to his forehead and chest by suction cups. Those wires led into the ground, into what was conceivably nothing. "Don't play with those quite yet. We'll take them off shortly. Now, you are Terrence. Is there anything else you remember? Think hard now." "I remember a hill. There was a star in the sky. I killed a snake." The doctor nodded his head. "Memories from the dream, no doubt. No, do you remember why you're here? Do you know what this place is?" "Looks like a closet." "Yes, it's small to maintain space. We have many occupants here at this facility. This is all the space that is allotted, I'm afraid. This is a prison cell, Mr. Walker. You've been imprisoned here for 20 years. We've kept you in a period of rest for that entire time, administered to you by a powerful sedative. We have been monitoring your brain activity here with the wires to make sure that you were kept under for the remainder of your time here." "What are you talking about? I was never imprisoned. I grew up in Kundal," Terrence murmured. "I was a medicine man. I was a master of alchemy. The past year I was on the run, I protected the general's daughter, and that was a simulation, nothing more. It seemed real, no doubt. It was supposed to seem real," the doctor said. "We've been using experimental technology in the last decade to better control our prison systems. By sedating every inmate, we cut costs of food and clothing, we conserve room, as you can see, and we avoid risk of inmate-related violence, which was an inescapable problem of the past until now. You were kept alive on a life support system, and twice a day we sent a shock to your brain, allowing your body to wake up and sleepwalk around your room for a short bit of exercise. Now, men like you, who are here to be punished for their crimes, are put into a very deep sleep that can last up to 50 years,
And just like a dream, you believe that you're awake and active during your sleep, living out a very real life. The drug is able to unite the unconscious and conscious hemispheres of the brain and bring them into a perfect equilibrium, where illusions of the unconscious or dreams are acted out as though they are absolutely real, with all the hunger, sleep, and 5 senses we take for granted here in the real world. How? How could that have been a dream? An understandable reaction. It is disorienting, I know, but it will all start coming back to you. You see, we didn't create your dream world. You did. We only set the stage. A dream is like an ink blot test. We supplied the blank canvas and dripped the paint on it. You interpreted the dream for what it was and built it as you went along, becoming stronger and stronger as it became more and more real. As this was no ordinary dream, am I right? Besides the fact that it was long, you had all the freedoms that you would have in the real world. You could eat food, perform sex, and go to sleep at night without a second thought. And all of it felt extremely real. This technology allows the prisoner the free comfort of freedom, even in a padded cell. This is the true vision behind this intervention. Even the criminal deserves some aspect of comfort, and this dream world allowed you that relief. Terence winced with a searing headache. But that wouldn't be real. Yes, certainly. But those 20 years of your incarceration just flew by, didn't they? The doctor smiled. This technology is highly controversial. The argument is that the criminal doesn't have the time to think about the crime and truly find his day of judgment, that this dream state is only distracting him with false ideals. Yet the entire prison is run on this technology. Like I said, there's no such thing as bad publicity. You have to let me go, Terence pleaded. I'm afraid not. We woke you because this is your day of judgment, Mr. Walker. The agreement is that the sleeper has to be awake for his execution, so he can remember what he did and pay the penalty for it. I'm afraid that day has come. But I didn't do anything wrong. I shouldn't be here. Terence attempted to stand, and the 3 men restrained him back into his bed. Seeing how weak he was, he stopped thrashing, but the doctors did not let go. You don't have any memory of what you did? The doctor asked him. No, I didn't do anything. I protected that woman. I loved her, Terence screamed. What woman? The star! Was her name Maggie White? No, I don't know who that is. This is common. The subject has a hard time differentiating between his 2 lives, he told the others. The doctor extracted a tape player and set it down on the bed. We tape the confessions of all our inmates, in hopes of jogging their memories at the end. The doctor pressed play, and Terence recognized his own voice inside the little speaker. My name is Terence Walker. I'm 27 years old, and I was arrested a month ago for murder. Yesterday in court I was found guilty of murdering Maggie White, my girlfriend, 4 years. I held her captive in my basement for 2 months in hopes of protecting her from her abusive father. I also murdered her father when he came to my door looking for her. I was only trying to help her. The voice was softer now, grinding away to nothing. Terence found that he was starting to cry. Her strange father came looking for her after her mother died. He only wanted the money Maggie inherited from the will, and he wouldn't take no for an answer. He became physical. The voice was rising again, now with fire. She wanted it all to end. She wanted to go to the police, but it was her father, and she couldn't bring herself to do it. I promised to help her. I offered her my home, and when she was reported missing, I hid her in my basement. I fed her, but when the police started questioning me, I panicked and locked her down there. I refused to open the door, fearing, I don't know. I was afraid that if I opened the door, she would leave me forever, after all I did for her. Then her father came to me. He didn't suspect me of anything. He was worried. He only wanted peace of mind. He heard her screams. I had to kill him. I started to pretend that nothing was wrong and that there was no one dying in my basement. I went to work as normal. I went about my life. I was burying her father in a cemetery when I was caught. I don't know. It all seems meaningless now. Mr. Walker, what about the girl's eyes? This was a new voice, an unnamed interviewer. Oh, that. I didn't have anything to do with it. Terence's voice was so calm, almost mechanical. When they found her body, some animal had taken them. I've seen mice down there before. The tape ran out, and the doctor pressed the stop button. Now do you remember? The doctor asked. Terence continued to weep under the restraints of the 3 men. That wasn't me. I didn't do that to her. I protected her. I kept her safe from him. I'm a doctor, just like you. Please, you have to know that wasn't me. That was your voice, Mr. Walker. And that other reality, vow was a dream. Whatever you think you did, none of it was real. None of it matters. You killed 2 people, and now you must be judged." The doctor motioned for the 2 guards at the door, and they walked forward to grab Terence. No, this is the dream. I'm going to wake up now." The doctors pressed their backs to the wall as the guards grabbed Terence under the arms. They lifted him to his feet. He was skinny and small, dressed in a white hospital gown with a shaved face and head. He didn't have an ounce of muscle on him, and they did not stagger under his weight. They dragged him to the door with ease and forced him into a cold hallway. "I'll wake up on that hill. I'll find her waiting for me. Please don't do this." He was dragged into a white room filled with light. The men forced him into a chair and restrained him with straps pulled much too tight across his emaciated chest. A woman stepped up in front of him, holding a syringe. She wore a similar uniform of white like the doctor's, only hers fanned out into a dress over her knees. She had a white surgical mask over her mouth, and her blonde hair was pulled back into a bun. No, I didn't hurt her, he screamed as she stuck his arm with the needle. The woman stepped back and then suddenly changed. She became an angel in an aura of white light. Her wings expanded behind her back, and her hair swept from right to left. The syringe was now a brass horn, and she put it to her lips and blew a call. The white light consumed her, leaving Terence in a colorless void of silence. He closed his eyes, and when he opened them again, he lay at the base of the hill, the water rolling up the beach and tasting his fingers. He must have rolled down the hill, possibly to escape the man with the knife. Nighttime was gone, replaced by the sun. He was alone, and he bled out from the chest. The sky was blue and clear. He looked out at the ocean and spotted a boat sailing away from the shore. In this boat was the Star, Olin's daughter. She was no longer blindfolded, and she did not carry her sword. She had glorious angel wings and a brass horn in her hands. She sat stoically, looking at the hill with a solemn gaze. Even as she drifted farther away, he could see her blue eyes shine in the sunlight. "This is real," he told her, and even though it was nothing but a whisper, he knew she could hear him. "This is what counts. You were right. I was always on the path to enlightenment, and that dream, that horrible place, was what I had to wake from. I will die in this world. And now you are enlightened." Her voice seemed to speak to him from inside his head. "I don't know. You must begin again." "How is that fair?" he asked. "Why do you get to leave by water while I remain rooted to the earth?" "Because I am ready to leave and you are not," she replied. "I can see again, but you are still blind. You're back where you started, on the same stretch of ground, but you can start again and do things differently. But don't be confused. I forgive you." "I'm sorry if I ever hurt you. I'm truly sorry," he cried into the sand. "What was your first memory?" she asked. "You were only a lad, and you created the road out of nothing, for you to walk on. Do that again. It's an ink blot test. You create your own surroundings. You make your own meaning." "I've heard that before. Where did I hear that?" But the boat had already disappeared over the horizon. He hung his head and fell quickly to sleep. The world reduced itself into nothing under him. All memory, all thought, all sense and pain were cleared from his slate, giving birth to a new world of darkness. When he opened his eyes, he was only a child, and he carried a knapsack in his arms. A road stretched out before him, and he blinked in bewilderment, not knowing where or who he was. All he knew was that he had a road to travel on. He looked at his hands and saw that he wore handcuffs around his wrists. Was he being punished? What had he been born to carry with him? The road seemed new, but he started to think that he had done this before in another life, only a dream now, and he would have to do it again. If only he could remember what he had done wrong. He would have to figure that out, he supposed. He wished that it was easier to remember a dream, especially when the brain was so hell-bent on piecing it together. All those dark visions swam at his back, prodding him forward, and he took his first step into the sunlight. He looked up into the sun and immediately lost his sight. Soon he would forget what it was like to see altogether. He staggered forward into the dark world, begging for an explanation. He begged for something. If only dreams weren't so cryptic and senseless, he thought to himself. If only. Too much sleep. Linda was over for her weekly visit at my cabin, her pant legs still wet from the long canoe ride, and we were trading ghost stories. Strangely enough, out of the hundreds of conversations we had shared there in my cabin, we had never tried to scare each other as we were, or even touched upon the spiritual realm. We usually just cooked food, talked about nature, listened to music on my transistor radio, or made love.
Maybe there was something about that night, like a thickness, without a single breeze to scratch the branches outside, or an animal to grace the well-worn trails. Or maybe it was because the sun had set so quickly, and it was too dark for Linda to travel home. So we curled up on my grandpa's couch with the lights as dark as the windows, and we wondered what we should do. "That radio is a dinosaur," Linda said to me. She was right. Even a grizzly man, as Linda liked to call me, knew that the cinder block-sized contraption sitting on my shelf would be refused by any pawn shop, even if it was given away for free. "Did you know that they make radios now that are—" "Hey, that sounds like outside talk," I interrupted playfully. She laughed, but did not persist. She knew it was a lost cause with me. Sometimes she would come over and mention in passing something from the news, or a new technology that interested her, and I would always cut her short. 12 years ago I had left the world, to distance myself from those distractions, politics, money, technology. I wasn't that old of a man, only in my late 30s, and Linda was just a little older than me, old enough to understand my strange fascination with the wilderness and my reluctance toward society. The childhood summers at my grandpa's cabin were some of the happiest memories I still keep. Fishing in the lake, hiking up the hills, chasing squirrels up and down trees. He had built the cabin with his own hands, and then later settled there to live a life of simplicity, completely alone, yet content. After my grandpa had died 12 years ago, leaving the cabin in my name, I vowed that I would live comfortably self-reliant in the forest like him, growing my own food, hunting my own meat, and finally rejoining the nature I had been born into as a dandelion seed. If only that cold wind hadn't stolen me away and dropped me into an even colder world. I only kept the radio around for Linda, in case we wanted to listen to some music. Hell, I didn't even have power. The radio ran on batteries, and the lamps in my cabin were oil. Still, she enjoyed visiting my cabin. She felt like she was going back in time whenever she stepped through my door. She was used to it by now. You see, whenever we met, she always crossed the lake to visit me, but I never crossed to visit her. She stopped trying to convince me to visit the town on the other side of the lake. Even though it only had a population of a few hundred people, I considered that town's civilization, the same civilization I had given up years ago. Linda was my final connection to the outside world, the one guilty pleasure I could not do without, even after all the things I had given up for the life in the wilderness. And although I forbade her from bringing her gadgets and her newspapers into my cabin, I loved to hear her speak. That night Linda stared longingly out the window, at the dark trees that appeared as cracks in the wall of the forest. She shivered to herself, and I felt the aftershock up my own body. "I could start a fire if you're cold," I told her. I reached over to brush the gray hairs away from her forehead. She looked at me with a set of deep green eyes, which I imagined had once been a stunning olive color in her youth. "No, I'm not cold," she said. "I just remembered an old story I once heard. It scared the hell out of me when I was a little girl. Maybe you've heard of it, the story of the Gaunt Man?" Doesn't ring a bell. It's an old Japanese folk tale about a tall, spindly man that lives in the woods, disguised as one of the tallest trees. He only shows himself to children as they hike through the woods at night. He follows them home and steals their souls from their bodies as they sleep, and then traps them inside the trees for all eternity. "Jesus, that's pretty grim," I said. "The trees at night have always spooked me. I know it's ridiculous. I think my dad only told me the story so I wouldn't go outside at night, or else the Gaunt Man would come get me." "I know I've heard a story like that," I said, trying to clear her mind. "It plays off the belief that when we go to sleep, our spirit leaves our body to wander the earth. One day a man sat down under a tree in the forest to sleep, and he decided to leave his body to explore. When he returned to enter his body, it was missing. A deer came by and told him that a cougar had eaten him. The man's spirit entered the deer's body instead, and he lived for many years as an animal in the woods. Then one day his path crossed that of a cougar, and he ran into a lake to escape, but he drowned, or something. I can't really remember it now." "What's the moral of that story?" Linda asked with a laugh. "Just because you can swim as a human doesn't mean you can swim as a deer," I offered her. "It's about the only scary story I have." Linda tapped an elongated nail against her lip. She rested her head on my shoulder and tucked her legs under our blanket. "I got another. I don't know where I heard it, but someone once told me that when you die you're visited by 3 spirits who judge your sins and prepare you for the afterlife." "Like the ghosts of Christmas past?" I laughed, but she was too consumed in her own thoughts to hear me. "Wait, speaking of ghosts," I said, pushing up from the couch. She watched me with interest as I rooted around in an old bureau and returned with a faded Polaroid picture.
I handed it to her and she squinted in the darkness. I brought over a lamp and we looked at it in the halo of light. In the picture, my father and his brother were inside the cabin, standing by the fire and holding the head of a deer up for the camera to see, their trophy from a day of hunting. Standing beside them was a faded image, blurred, yet still crisp enough to make out. I didn't even need to point out the period attire, the head, shoulder, and the clear facial features for her to see it was the transparent figure of a man. She gasped and looked at me in the eye. "Is this my grandpa?" I said. This picture was taken only days after he died. My dad and his brother came out here one weekend in his memory, and this is what they found, their father posing in the picture with them. "Oh my God, that's so creepy," she blurted. I almost had to tear the picture out of her hand to return it to the drawer. "Do you think he's still here?" I looked around the living room as if expecting to find my grandpa leaning up against the fireplace. I don't know. I sense him sometimes, but that may be because all this stuff was once his, and it still holds his scent, his energy. If he was still here, you'd think he'd say hello sometime. A crack of lightning lit up the room, and we both jumped. We looked at each other with our hands on our hearts, smiling and breathing hard. She hurried to the window and looked outside. Already there was the pitter of pin and needle raindrops on the glass. She cursed and hurried to find her coat. "Whoa, I thought you were spending the night," I called after her. "I left all the windows open in my house. I didn't expect it to rain tonight," she said, opening my door. "And we both know when it rains here, it rains." I followed her outside with my collar turned up. We strode down the hill together and onto the wooden dock over the lake, now choppy with dark ripples of water. Linda's canoe bobbed in the surf, tied to a post with a length of rope. The rain was picking up now, and the clouds had covered the moon completely, snuffing out all natural light. We only had the soft haze of the houses on the other side of the lake, where people sat around electric TVs and glowing light bulbs. I had a flash of the first day I'd met her, there in the lake, right outside my front lawn. I was swimming and she happened by in her canoe. I remember coming to the surface near her boat, surprising her so much that she dropped her paddle. My face tensed with a smile, but then dropped again. I kissed her sadly and she sensed my distress. "Come across with me," she said. "Linda, you know I can't." "Come on. I can't walk home alone, not with all those dark trees. Who will protect me from the gaunt man?" She prodded me with a smile, and that smile was so lovely I swooned into her. "I don't know." She nodded her head, the raindrops trickling down the length of her bangs and the wrinkles on her face. She kissed me again and climbed into the canoe. Before she could go, I felt my body duplicate into two separate doubles. My double stepped out of my body as if it were only shrugging off a coat and stepped into the canoe with Linda. She squealed happily and threw her arms around him. Both of them selected a paddle and set off across the dark lake, which might as well have been an ocean for me, standing on the dock watching them go. This private island would be the death of me, surely. Too Much Sleep, Part 2. A week later, I was in the woods behind my cabin in the late afternoon, watching a deer through the telescopic lens of my rifle. I thought about Linda and the last time I had seen her, stepping into her canoe in the rain. I hadn't seen her since then. More than a week had passed and she had missed our date together. I had waited by the shore of the lake, hoping to catch a glimpse of her canoe, but it never came. What worried me was that she never missed a date. I couldn't call her because I didn't have a phone, and I wasn't about to paddle over to her side. Was she angry with me? Had something happened to her? I cursed myself for not getting into that canoe. It hadn't been the first opportunity I'd passed up. It used to be that my promise to my grandpa was enough of a conviction. The promise to take care of his cabin and live there for as long as I could. At the end of his life, he worried so much about his land, and it later became my major fear, a shared burden that was passed down for me to carry. To leave it for a day would be to abandon it, and with the abandonment of the cabin would be the abandonment of my duty. My isolation from society was nothing short of a sacred oath, like something a monk would devote his life to, knowing that it was for some greater good, not yet fully realized. If I was to cross that lake, it would be like undoing all the long years I had proudly carved into those cabin walls. It would be like a smoker disciplining himself for a decade and then suddenly giving in to temptation. After that, what is there? I had gone too far to give up now, and that was what killed my grandpa in the end. Once he had disciplined himself to the point of no return, his destiny was already sung. And when he did pass, he died in the upstairs bedroom of his cabin, without a single loved one at his bedside. As I held my rifle, I thought of my grandpa, and how he had first taught me to handle it, with the stock comfortably nestled against my shoulder. I sat on the upper bough of a tree with my legs dangling down, listening to the pops and cracks of an animal in motion. Then a deer strode into the clearing ever so carefully, a female doe, older, with a thick pelt and murky eyes. I watched the deer through my sight, counting my heartbeats. I held my breath and applied pressure to the trigger. I thought about the deer head from the ghost picture, and how Linda had responded to it, shaking excitedly like a child. The deer looked right up at me, and I choked on my breath. It didn't move. It just stared at me with those dark eyes. I knew that if I stayed comfortably still, it couldn't sense my presence. Then it spoke to me in a deep and raspy voice. "She's not coming back," the deer told me. I panicked and squeezed the trigger. The bullet struck the deer in the shoulder, and I watched its flesh ripple, as if a pebble had been thrown into a body of water. It collapsed to the grass without a sound. I didn't stop to gather the carcass. I didn't even look back at it. Jumping down from my perch, I sprinted back to my cabin and charged inside. With the gun still in my hand, I collapsed on the couch. I tossed it aside, and it skated across the hardwood floor, to rest by the hearth of the fireplace. I put my head in my hands and gulped for air as my world spun behind my eyelids. What I needed was a splash of cold water on my face, so I stood up to find the kitchen. The room spun, and I caught myself against the dining room table. Right when my vision started to clear, I watched a man materialize at one of the chairs. Only a shadow at first, and then slowly gathering dimension and shape, as though developing on a sheet of film. I jumped back with my heart seizing in my chest. It was my grandpa as a young man, as I remembered him from when I was a boy, and he was as solid as me. His blonde hair was slicked back, and he wore a crisp vest over a red turtleneck sweater. He smiled at me brightly and offered me to sit with him. I plopped down hard into an open chair. "How are you doing, son?" he asked me with a voice that didn't quite match his lips. The voice sounded distant, as if it were underwater or imprisoned inside a seashell. "Gran?" I croaked, and he nodded his head. "Are you really here?" At this point, all feeling had trickled off my body to pool around my heels. "I've always been here," he said. "You have to cross the water. Nothing keeps you here, or me." "What are you saying?" "Sometimes we stray too far from our roots and can't go back. We all carry darkness with us, and hers ran deep. It's what carried me to this dark corner of the world, but I couldn't escape it. Not really. It's when we sleep too much and hold too fast to these dreams that we're not sure what's important anymore, what's truly real." Before I could speak, my grandpa was already fading out of existence. I watched him go and felt my energy return to my body. I bolted outside and looked out across the lake. Usually I could see the houses on the other side, but today they were obscured by a heavy mist over the surface of the water. I'd never seen anything like it in all my years at the cabin. I stood on the edge of the dock, wondering how I was going to get across. As if to answer my question, a lone canoe came drifting into view, empty and somewhat unsettling. It bumped with the dock, and I reached over to grab hold. I fell inside and struggled to right myself in the chaos of splashing water. I found a lone paddle and waded forward into open water, putting my grandpa's cabin at my back. I hadn't left my little island for 12 long years, but strangely enough, I didn't look back. Not that I could see anything in the thickening fog. I felt like I was out there for hours, which didn't seem right, judging by the size of the lake. I watched as the fog turned to a solid gray, and then into a black screen. The sun had left me with nothing but a chilled wind and a wet pair of pants, too cold for comfort. The lake was so still and quiet, I had never heard it that silent, not without the incessant chirping of the crickets. The dip of my paddle into the water hardly made a sound. I started to breathe through my mouth, just so I could hear something. Finally, the mist cleared and my canoe grinded with the shore. I fell onto cold grass and inhaled the night air. I looked up, and illuminated in the soft light of the moon was Linda's cottage, only a doll's house from where I was, but I knew it was hers. She had often pointed to it from across the lake, sometimes through a set of binoculars for a better look. The house with the red trim and the cherry tree in the yard. It was her favorite tree in the garden, she told me. A strange grove of trees separated me from the house, which I hadn't noticed before. I walked slow, watching as the naked trees scratched their branches together. Then I was right underneath them, their bodies nothing short of brick towers, and their arms like the complicated workings of a spider web, weaving and knitting into one collective canopy over my head. Then something moved to the left, while all the trees blew to the right. It appeared as only a crooked figure stepping out from behind one of the trees, and once it joined my path, I saw that this creature was all legs, and they were long. It moved toward me with the delicacy of a spider, another set of thin lines extending from its body in the shape of arms. Long, spindly fingers curled and uncurled within its hand. In the night, it was only a black figure without any real substance, but I could see what appeared to be a roundish head set atop its twig of a body. I could see the reflection of light in its eyes, only dimes from where I was standing. I watched panic-stricken, rooted to the spot as the creature slinked toward me without ever making a sound. It stopped a few yards away, standing 15 feet tall at the least, its legs spread, and its arms hanging low to the ground, fingers curling and uncurling. It was hunched over, head bowed as if in prayer, and it stood perfectly still. One might have mistaken it for a tree growing out of the very path, if it hadn't spoken to me, of course. "We don't speak of such stories, not even when the trees are not themselves, when they are shadowed," the gaunt man said. His voice was but a whisper, a breathy exhale of air, which mimicked the sound of the wind in the trees. "Don't we know such stories act as prayers, drawing the darkness in rather than the light?" I had nothing to say. I stood below the creature, waiting for it to do something, anything. Even its fingers had stopped moving. I blinked my eyes for a few minutes, and the more moisture I brought to them, the more the creature resembled a tree in the middle of the path. After a while I realized that its spread legs were actually two different trees touching, and the arms were only low-hanging boughs, with branch-like fingers. The head was nothing more than a knot in one of the trunks. I slowly navigated around the trees, and ran the rest of the way to Linda's house. It was dark, and all the windows were closed. I ran past the cherry tree and into the house, skating up the stairs as if I was on a track. I passed through another door, and there was Linda, sleeping in her bed with the moonlight spilling in through the unshaded window, throwing crazy shadows across the ripples of her blankets. And I was lying in the bed with her, at least my body was, my arm around her waist. I looked at the window, and the pane of glass was still speckled with fresh rain. I hurried to Linda's bedside, my hands reaching out to touch her face, but passing right through. I saw that she wasn't breathing, and her skin was so pale, her mouth hanging slightly ajar. "I went home with her that night," I said out loud. "She didn't go out into the dark alone." My face filled with tears, and I didn't know if they were real or not. I wasn't even sure that the fingers that wiped them away were real. They felt solid. I kneeled by the side of her bed for some time, staring at Linda's vacant face. I wondered whether I should re-enter my body and try to shake her awake. I wondered whether I should call an ambulance or perform CPR, but I couldn't sense the slightest flicker of life in her face. I stood up and floated out through the window, hovering above Linda's tidy little garden and cherry tree. I was sad that I hadn't visited this garden earlier, that I hadn't helped her trim those hedges or plant those flowers into the soft soil. I was sad that I hadn't seen her at her best, happily standing below that tree, picking the cherries like candy, maybe saving a few for her pantry or popping a few into her mouth right then and there. Even though the wind had died down and the night had gone still, the cherry tree waved at me, its branches clicking against Linda's bedroom window. It seemed to groan at my presence, every bud and leaf on its body trembling with light. Light filled my senses, and I placed a hand on the trunk, so warm to the touch. I felt her stir inside her earthly shell, her voice coming to meet me across a long distance. I smiled and pressed my face against the bark, feeling her lips kiss my cheek. Something insisted on rooting me to this world, at least for a little while longer. Everything I needed was there in nature, only not in the nature I had always envisioned on my distant island, forever swimming in the lake and chasing squirrels. I found everything in the warm embrace of a cherry tree, in the rain-soaked garden of my deceased love, And to think a town was right there at my back, where people still shopped in stores and woke up to the morning news. It had been there all along, and just like my grandpa in his cabin long faded on a crumpled Polaroid, so had I.
Tune in next time for 3/4 from Heaven, parts 1 through 4. Until then, guard your soul.